Well, Sego Guego, Ronalyn Pollack Yungyets, Mississauga the Credit, First Nation, Six Nations of the Grand River, Nidewa Genun, Ganyangeha, Anishinaabe, Aquaxnawagi Deloda. I said, hello, everyone. My name is Ronalyn Pollack. I am Mississauga the Credit, First Nation, and Six Nations of the Grand River, because my grandmother was Mohawk, and she was Six Nations of the Grand River, and we are a matriarchal society, so you go by what your grandmother is. I said that I am Mohawk and Anishinaabe, and being Anishinaabe, we are part of the Eagle clan. It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you all this morning, and hopefully what I have to bring will leave an imprint, and it will leave you inspired, and certainly, more significantly, leave you with an impression of forgiveness and how we can all be exercising and extending forgiveness. So I want to say, too, while I didn't grow up with my culture, I was born and raised here. I was not born and raised on the reservation. I feel like my culture has always been within me. It's been embedded in my DNA. God knew what he was doing when he was knitting me and creating me in my mother's womb. So I will bring what I know and what I have been taught primarily in my adult years, and I'll bring and share that with you today. One thing, too, about our people, we are an oral culture, an oral society. Although in modern day times now, a lot of it is being put to script and being put to written word, but a lot of our teachings are oral. So there may be variations of some of the stories that are part of our culture and part of our tradition. So I will share with you what I have come to know today, and what I've been taught. And one thing, too, that's significant about the Haudenosaunee, and I really believe all Indigenous nations, is that we believe when we share our stories, we heal. And that sounds familiar, right? It sounds like Revelations 12:11, where we are overcome when we share our testimony. And so that's part of what I'll be bringing to you today. The first part, I'll tell you the story about the Peacemaker. And then the story of the Peacemaker, there'll be a second part that I will share, and how this story relates still today in a modern day form that primarily speaks of forgiveness. So the story of the Haudenosaunee people, so Haudenosaunee is the people of the Longhouse. You may recognize it as Iroquois, and that's our flag up there. It's the Hiawatha belt flag. Traditionally are usually referred to as the Haudenosaunee flag. You may recognize the term more as Iroquois. That's a very French-derived word that was given to us, but we refer to ourselves as the Haudenosaunee. So some of the history of the Haudenosaunee, it starts, many years ago, where we were warring nations. When we were just five separate nations at that time, we were warring, and it was pretty significant. There were significant battles. There was a lot of violence, a lot of, murder, even cannibalism that took place. And so when Creator saw this, Creator saw that's not good. That's not going to be sustainable. And I want to say, too, when I say Creator, I also mean God. I'm referring to the God that knit me in my mother's womb, the God who is the same today, yesterday, and forever, and the God that I worship. That may be different for other Native Americans, and that's fine. But for me, there's definitely that connection. So anyway, Creator saw that as we were these incredibly warring nations, it was not good. It was not going to be sustainable. And so he knew he needed to send us a peacemaker to bring peace to all of that. So on the northern shores of Lake Ontario, there was a village, and within this village, much like all of the other Haudenosaunee territory where there was great war taking place, there was war also happening here. And so there was a mother and her daughter, and because of the violence and the warring that was taking place, they sought isolation, and so they kind of hid themselves deep in the bush, very isolated, so they wouldn't become captive or they wouldn't be killed. And as a result, as they were, spending many years, in isolation for protection, and it was just the two of them, the daughter all of a sudden finds herself pregnant. And the mother maybe now soon to be grandmother, is very upset by this news. And she's asking the daughter, how did this happen? She's really upset. And the daughter says, I don't know. I've not been with anyone. I've not seen anyone. I've not talked to anyone because we're purposely hiding ourselves away in isolation. Kind of sounds familiar, right? So nonetheless, the daughter ended up having the baby. The grandmother was still very distraught about this. And as a result, she attempted to kill the baby, not once, but 3 times. The first time she tried to bury the baby. She took the baby away, buried the baby. And when she returned back to where her and her daughter's camp was, the baby was there in its mother's arms. The second time she tried to burn the baby, took the baby away, thought she had burned and killed the baby. When she came back, again, there was the baby in its mother's arms. The third time she tried, I don't know why she was trying so consistently to do this, but anyway, the third time she tried to drown the baby, thought she had drowned the baby. Again, when she came back, there was the baby in its mother's arms. So clearly there was intended purpose behind this baby. And it was at that time that the grandmother was actually visited by a messenger. And the messenger said that this baby was sent with a great message. And the great message contained peace, power, and righteousness. Again, sounds very familiar. So then at that point, the grandmother accepted the baby and she helped her daughter raise the young boy. And as the peacemaker, grown and became a man, he at that point was making a white stone canoe, which kind of puzzles me too, because I'm thinking white stone canoe, like that's pretty impressive, but how do you make a stone canoe buoyant? Anyway. Well beyond my engineering understanding, but nonetheless, he built this white stone canoe, and there was reason behind that too, because wherever he was going to travel in this canoe, this white stone canoe kind of speaks of someone in it holding some type of majesty. It had this majestic presence about it. So he built the canoe and traveled across Lake Ontario and landed at the shores of the southern part of Lake Ontario, which is really to be believed in the area and the vicinity of Rochester, which is Seneca territory, by the way. So Rochester and Monroe County, this is all traditional Seneca territory lands. And it's where his spot was. It could have been Durand Beach. It could have been Seabreeze. But in any case, it was somewhere within that region. And so when he arrived, the first person to meet him was a woman by the name of Jigonhsasee. And Jigonhsasee, she part of her work that she did, she was known to receive travelers in her longhouse. She was known to bring them in, to feed them, to care for them, and really to provide them direction along their traveling, because she was very familiar with our pathways. So as being the first person to receive him, she was also the first one to hear and accept his message of peace that he was bringing. And so as such, from what I understand in the story, the version that I've come to learn, is that from that point on, she really kind of served as his travel concierge from that point throughout the rest of the Haudenosaunee territory. And so they traveled over to the area or the territory of the Mohawks. Now, if you can envision New York State, all the way over to the eastern side, right, is the Mohawk Valley or the Hudson Valley. That's Mohawk territory. So she took him and they traveled over there. And there is actually the first time, too, where he met Hiawatha. And Hiawatha was really grieved at that time because he had lost his daughters. And so when the Peacemaker met Hiawatha, he actually significantly helped him overcome his grief. And Hiawatha then also accepted the message that the Peacemaker was bringing. When he was with the Mohawks, the other thing about our culture too is that we believe in prophecy. We have prophetic words, some that have been told long ago, but we certainly live with the expectation that those prophetic words will manifest and will come forth. So when the Peacemaker arrived to the Mohawks and claimed who he was, the Mohawks weren't very surprised. They said, "Oh, this is the fulfillment of the prophecy. You are who we were expecting." But they weren't sure that they could trust this person. So they presented a challenge for him. And they believed that if he survived this challenge, then he would definitely be who he said he is there to be. And so the challenge was, there was a tree sticking out over these falls, which is now believed to have been the spot of where Cohoes Falls is today. And so there was a tree out there, and they said, okay, if you are who you say you are, then go out on that tree and go over the falls. And if you survive, then certainly will believe who you say you are. So he did, and he took the challenge and went over the falls, and the Mohawks waited, and he never reemerged. And so they said, oh, okay, he was just an imposter. Moving on. So there are two versions that I understand. One is that when the Mohawks returned back to their village, the Peacemaker was outside of their village at a campfire, which is very traditional too, before you go into someone's village. The second version was that the Mohawks returned, they said, okay, he was just an imposter. They went to sleep, and then the next morning when they woke up, he was outside of their village at a campfire. So this, certainly left them with the assurance that, wow, this really is the Peacemaker. This is who he says he is. And so as such, they heard his message of peace that he was bringing, and they accepted it. They agreed to it. And from that point on, Hiawatha, Jigonhsasee, they were still traveling with the Peacemaker. And also, too, Hiawatha ended up being a spokesperson for the Peacemaker. Because interestingly enough, a small tidbit is that it was known that the Peacemaker had a speech impediment. And so Hiawatha served as his spokesperson as they traveled to the rest of the nations throughout the Haudenosaunee territory to bring the message of peace to all of these nations. Because again, remember, Creator saw that there was this incredible warring, and he wanted to bring peace. So as they're carrying this message of peace throughout the nations, really the Oneida Nation is sometimes seen as like the little brother of the Mohawks. So whatever the Mohawks agree and adapt to, the Oneidas will typically do that. When they came over to the Senecas, and the Senecas agreed and accepted and adapted to this message of peace that the Peacemaker was bringing, the Cayugas are kind of seen as almost like the little brothers of the Senecas. So they also agreed to accept this message of peace. The last nation, however, they knew would present a great challenge, and that was the Onondagas. The Onondagas, where Onondaga County is and where the Onondaga Nation still is today, they had a fierce and feared warrior named Tadodaho. And Tadodaho was very violent, very fierce, very feared. It was believed that he lived in the swamps. So if you can think of Montezuma along the pathway, right, of the thruway, which was actually part of our original pathways, that is where he lived. And he was so contrite and so violent and so fierce that he was almost unrecognizable in his human form. So when people would see him, it was like he had snakes in his hair and his body was crooked. And he was incredibly, incredibly violent. And so they knew that coming to him to bring this message of peace, it would be very difficult for him to accept it. And then therefore it would be very difficult for the Onondaga Nation to accept, to be the final nation to accept this message of peace and provide unity for all. So there are a couple different versions that I understand with the Peacemaker, with Tadodaho, and how he eventually came to accept this message of peace. One version I understand is that he was cooking He was also a cannibal, so I'm not quite sure. I want to imagine what he may have been cooking, but nonetheless, he was cooking. And as he looked over into the pot of what he was stirring over the campfire, he saw the peacemaker's reflection. But now the legend, the oral tradition also says that the peacemaker went atop of his longhouse and was looking down through the smoke hole. But nonetheless, he saw the peacemaker's face. And when he saw the peacemaker's face, that was the first moment that his heart began to soften. And he then was willing to listen to the peacemaker. And then that is, from what I understand of that version, that is when he had a transformation and his heart was no longer stony and began to accept this message of peace. Another version I understand is that the peacemaker, Jigonhsasee, Hiawatha, and then all of the chiefs that were now forming this council as each nation accepted the message of peace, they all presented to Tadodaho this message of peace. But again, he, was really resistant at first. So the other version that I understand is that they were all approaching him. So these 49 chiefs, Peacemaker, Jigonhsasee, and Hiawatha, and as they were approaching him, they were reciting poetry. And as they were reciting this poetry and also singing songs, that's when his heart began to change, when his heart began to shift and become softened. And then that is when he accepted the message of peace that the peacemaker was bringing. And as too they were doing that, I also understand that Jigonhsasee was singing to him. And as she was singing to him, she was able to comb the snakes out of his hair. And that was really when he had his transformational moment. So great. Now we have all of the nations accepting this message of peace. And also too, by the way, I said the peacemaker, had Jigonhsasee, Hiawatha, all of these chiefs. He had a lot of followers. Again, sounds very familiar. So once all of the nations and the last nation, Onondaga, finally accepted this message of peace and they were all agreeable to it, the peacemaker brought them to the great white pine, which we now refer to as the tree of peace. And as they came, he also asked them to bring all of their weapons. And so the peacemaker uprooted this great white pine and he had them bury their weapons there. Their figurative weapons, but it was also very symbolic because as they were about to bury these, tangible weapons, they were also burying the symbolic weapons. And those weapons were the hatred, the anger, the violence, the jealousy, the bitterness, the rage. They were also symbolically burying all of those weapons at the same time. And so Peacemaker knew that once they buried these weapons, that very deep in the ground, there are undercurrents of water. And as, time goes on, that those weapons would eventually meet that water and be carried out and disappear forever, so that we would never return back to our unrest. And we would never return back to our warring state because we were agreeing to this message of peace. So he uprooted the tree, or put it back in its right place. And so it's very symbolic for us. And also too, there is an eagle that sits atop the tree. And the eagle is perched there and is always looking across our territory and across our lands to be aware of if there's any discontent or any arguing or any unrest. And if it notices any, it will let out a shriek. And as it lets out its shriek, it's a reminder to us that, hey, we agreed to accept this message of peace that the peacemaker brought directly to us. And so once this happened, this is now what formed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We were now an entire unified confederacy, and it's represented. So the square all the way over to the right, that is the Mohawks. Then you have, and if it's almost like you could look at this as a map of New York State as well, too. Then coming, westward to the left, there's the Oneidas. In the middle is the Onondaga. And actually, that is meant to symbolize the Tree of Peace as well. Then you have the Cayugas, and then finally the Senecas, where we are today. A side note, too, because you may be asking, well, aren't there 6 nations? And there are. These were the original nations of the Confederacy. The Tuscaroras came and joined us as the 6th nation in about 1723, 22, 24, because they were seeking asylum. And so we said, yes, we'll invite you in. We'll allow you to be here, and you can become the 6th nation. So this is very significant. So now we are, certainly well beyond our years and our times of warring, and we have now accepted and agreed to enter into a forever state of peace. And we take that very seriously because we recognize what an honor it is that the Peacemaker came directly to us to bring this message of peace. And so as the Peacemaker left, he also left us with what is referred to as the Great Law, or the Great Law of Peace. And it's an instruction manual in how we're to honor and keep peace and remember the instruction that he gave us as we forever live in peace with one another. Again, sounds familiar. So, this is something as Haudenosaunee we take very, very seriously about maintaining this peace. It is something that we recognize we are meant to keep amongst ourselves first. So we maintain that peace amongst our own people, amongst our own nations, but then wherever we go outside of that, we are to take that message of peace with us as well. And also, very importantly, we are meant to teach our generations, our young people, our children, this message of peace, so it will always continue and stay steadfast and remain with us as Haudenosaunee people. So that is the first part of my message that I wanted to bring to you. But now I want to tie it into, like I said, a very modern day story that deals with Haudenosaunee, but also, more importantly, encapsulates a message of forgiveness. So back in the summer of 2018, I became executive director of the Native American Cultural Center here in Rochester. I said it was a position I was never looking for. It was never on my radar, but somehow it found me. And I was kind of reluctant about it, to be honest with you. So much so that I actually declined the position politely, not once, but twice. And then clearly I was like, okay, God, duly noted, got it. You picked me, okay. And so some of the hesitancy I had, it wasn't the great challenge I knew that was ahead of me, because I knew going into this that unfortunately the cultural center had been dysfunctionally operating for many, many years. And so I knew that going in, there would be a lot of work that would be involved. And that part didn't scare me. But what I didn't necessarily feel very confident about was that I had the backing, and that I had strength in the backing to make these changes and implement some of these policy changes. So that was part of my hesitancy. So I knew these changes were needed, but again, understanding that I didn't necessarily have the backing I needed at that time, I kind of put that on hold. I put that on the back burner, and I focused my efforts elsewhere, because something that was also perplexing to me was, as a very small non-for-profit, we at the time didn't have well-established relationships with local foundations and local funders. And I was kind of like, wow, it's kind of like non-for-profit 101. But anyway, I set about making those inroads, if you will, making those establishments with local foundations and local funders. And at the same time, while this was going on, I was experiencing personal attacks. It wasn't only myself, but it was also the other administration, the board members really, that were involved with the Cultural Center at that time. And the reason for it was much of my community was not very happy with me taking on this position. They weren't very happy with my installment, if you will, or my appointment to this position. And the previous director was very disgruntled about this. And as a result, they took their feelings of being disgruntled throughout our community. And our community isn't an anomaly, right? This happens in many communities. We all know that if there is a person who is disgruntled and wants to spill some tea, there are people that will show up and listen, right? There are some of those, unfortunately, people that just have that negative, gravitational pull almost, right? And they'll show up with their popcorn. So this is what I unfortunately had to endure and I had to experience. So there was a lot of personal attacking. It almost felt like I had a target on me. And I knew also too, going into this position, that is what any type of leadership position is comprised of, right? That sometimes people are just going to need to point the finger at someone and it ends up being the one that is part of administration or is in a leadership position. And that part didn't bother me so much. I knew that that's what I was getting into. But when you experience this from your own people, right? I'm still human. Like, it's still really difficult to endure. It's still really difficult to have to go through that, to kind of receive this beratement and this constant attacking and accusations that are coming out of the previous director, who was very disgruntled about what had happened. And so a lot of my time initially was spent putting out all these small fires that had been intentionally, it seemed, started, and getting rid of all these hornets' nests, that were purposely being kicked around. And that's difficult. So my heart's cry at that time, I was really crying out to God, like, can you please send somebody else to do this? I told you I didn't want to do this in the first place, and I am completely happy if you send somebody else in right now to take this over, because this isn't fun anymore, and I kind of don't want to do this. Because, by the way, I didn't want to do it in the first place. But nonetheless, here I was. And so nobody was ever sent. And I was like, oh, okay. Again, duly noted. Check that. Got the message. Okay. So if I am meant to stay in this position, my next heart's cry became, there has to be, okay, if I'm going to stay here, I'm okay with that. Like, I'll take it. I got it. But if I'm going to stay in this position, my heart's cry became, there has to be some resemblance somewhere in whatever my purpose time is here of forgiveness and of reconciliation, and ultimately that leads to unity. I said, that is something that I want to see happen. And maybe if that's why you have me here, if that's part of my purpose, I'm willing to do that. And so it was something that I had to contend for. And sometimes you have to be willing to contend for that. You have to be willing to be brave enough to say and declare that, yes, I believe forgiveness will take place, and I believe that will be the outcome, but you have to know what you're signing up for too. I knew it also wasn't going to be easy, but I was willing to stay there and contend for that. So then some time had gone by, and some of the small fires, were being extinguished, and they weren't being, it seemed as though started so frequently anymore. And then at this time too, there was an overturn in our board just because some of the terms had run out. And so now with the installment of some of these new board members, I knew I had the strength now. I knew I had the backing that I needed. And so it felt very much like we were all on the same page. We worked very fluidly together. And we all, more importantly, understood the work that was necessary to right what maybe had been, wronged or dysfunctionally run for so many years. So as we were beginning to make some of these changes, to policies, to procedures, to bylaws, just as we were beginning to make implementation of those changes, the pandemic hit. I was like, oh, okay. So just when you feel like you're gaining ground, right, all of a sudden, like that's taken away. And then just prior to this, really a breath prior to the pandemic hitting, we also suffered an internal crisis. And as a small non-for-profit, any kind of crises can, really get put into subject a lot of what you're doing. But this crisis was pretty significant, and so it put a lot of things kind of on hold. And it really required all of our attention to go there. So while I'm not going to say I'm grateful for a pandemic, the timing of it was very interesting because it allowed us, while everybody, right, was kind of quarantining and, being remote in their own homes, it allowed us to focus on rectifying this crisis that we had experienced. And so as we were bringing, rectifying to this crisis, we found, as we peeled back further layers, because now we had time to, because we weren't doing our normal daily operational stuff, we began to discover wow, oh my gosh, it is really worse than what we originally thought. And as we were discovering these things, it was almost, really now putting into subject the entire functioning and maybe even continued operation of the organization. And so we were faced then with some very difficult decisions, some very difficult long-term decisions that we had to make. And I have to say, I was definitely the last one to come on board with some of these decisions. Because as a director in your position, it's part of your responsibility to be bringing, options and opportunities and funding possibilities. And then, your board kind of says yay or nay. And so as I was bringing all of them to all of these opportunities, to kind of still sail through this pandemic while providing opportunities for our community, it was always met with wow, Ronnie, that sounds like a great idea, but I don't think so. We're not in a space to really go there right now. And I was like, okay. So I finally accepted that. And I'm like, okay, maybe it does make sense for us to make some of these really difficult decisions that we have to make. And part of that was putting on kind of a permanent/temporary pause for the organization, which really transposes into being non-operational. And it was difficult to get there. But once I did, and once we finally made that decision, that was actually the first time I felt peace. And it was the first time I felt peace since stepping into that position, which is really interesting, right? Because now everything's seemingly about to come to a halt. So within making this difficult decision, not only were we suspending our operations on a more, kind of temporal permanent basis, but we were also forced to sell our property. And then we're forced to sell our property during a time where the commercial market was horrible. The residential market was on fire, as it still is, but the commercial market, it was awful. And so it was piece by piece, as we started to peel back those layers, it was piece by piece, slowly everything seemed as though it was falling apart. But I still had incredible peace. So we came to the realization that we needed to sell our property, which meant that we were getting rid of a lot of things, that it felt like we were getting rid of our identity because now we were losing our address. We were going to lose our phone number that, the organization had for many years. And while that sounds like such a small detail, some of the details are significant when you're going through them. So anyway, it looked as though everything was crumbling, and that's what it felt like. But again, I still always maintained that significance of peace. And so as, it looked as though everything was crumbling, as something crumbles, it creates a pile of ashes. And as I realized, for anybody from the outside looking in, they would look at this situation and be like, wow, that's a hot mess. Like, oh, and by the way, Ronnie, that hot mess happened on your watch. And, but again, I still felt peace. And so as everything was crumbling and now seemingly this big pile of ashes, I recognized, wait a minute, the phoenix can only rise out of a pile of ashes. And I know that he gives me beauty for ashes. And so for the first time, I recognized, wow, there is such purpose in these ashes. And it became so clear to me that it had to happen this way. It had to crumble. Everything needed to fall this way, because the other thing that was very relevant is that the negative clutches that had been embedded in the cultural center for really decades, now they had nothing to grip onto anymore because everything was this pile of ashes. And we know too, and maybe some of you know, that when you do a purposed agricultural burn, right, it gets rid of all the stagnancy. It gets rid of all the dead things that were choking the life out of that ground, out of that soil. And those ashes actually create fertile ground. And so I saw that not only can the phoenix rise from the ashes, and he gives me beauty for ashes, but for whenever the center is meant to rise again, these ashes create a fertile ground for that to happen. But in order for that to happen, I also recognized that this was a significant opportunity for healing to take place. So these ashes, again, I saw the purpose in them, and I also saw this incredible platform for healing to take place. Because really the reality was, if the cultural center was ever, and really our community, was ever going to experience healing, now is the time, right? If not now, then when? Because we were in this significant crisis. We were in this incredible turmoil. And so, as the phoenix rises, right, as the ashes replenish the soil, and as those negative clutches would no longer have anything to clutch into, again, I saw the purpose in that temporary closing, in selling the property and getting rid of everything. And so I knew the time was ripe for healing, but I didn't necessarily know what that was supposed to look like. So just to give you a time frame, when we made the decision to close, that was like the end of last summer, beginning of last fall. And so the time of, the revelation of the purpose and the ashes, that was all becoming clear to me in the heat of last fall. So I knew that, again, the healing pump was being primed, if you will. And so I recognized, all right, in this time of healing, I kind of got excited because I knew, well, maybe this means this is where forgiveness begins to take a role and begins to take place. So I've been on many other forgiveness journeys. So you kind of sometimes begin to recognize when God is providing opportunity for that journey to take place again. And I believe he does give us that opportunity, but it's up to us to make the choice. We have a choice that we can make. And so with that time and feeling almost like this excitement, knowing what was about to happen, at the end of last year, even though I wasn't looking for it, but maybe my spirit was expecting it, I felt a complete shifting. And I felt like almost a heart change or a breakthrough, whatever you want to call it. But I definitely felt a significant shift. And within this shift, I felt a completely different way towards one particular individual. And if somebody had come to me the 2 years prior to that and said, hey, Ronnie, do you feel any kind of way towards that individual who had purposely, maybe, been starting all those fires and kicking around all those hornets' nests? And I would have said, no, I don't, because truly it's nothing that I want to have as part of my character. It's nothing that I want to emulate. I want to live in a place of forgiveness and freedom, really. And so I would say, no, I don't feel a certain way. Like, I'm okay, even though they created all of this mayhem that I had to deal with and all of these personal attacks. Like, no, at the same time, I don't think I feel any certain way towards them. But when I had this heart shift, I recognized, like, wait a second. As I began to embrace compassion and embrace forgiveness with this heart shift, it also allowed me to see something more clearly. And I believe that's what happens when we have that willingness to embrace forgiveness, which we're really also embracing compassion. It allows for clarity of vision. And within this clarity of vision, this clear vision I had, I could see very specifically that in my time as director, there were decisions that I made, and maybe even more importantly, there were decisions that I didn't make that could have caused direct harm to that one individual. And when I realized that, it grieved my heart significantly. Because, again, that is nothing I want to emulate. That is nothing I want to have representative of my character. And so when I experienced, this heart shift, this realization, this incredible grieved heart, I wanted to express my sorrowfulness towards this individual. And I wanted to extend forgiveness too for everything that had transpired, that had happened. And so I knew that reaching out to them directly didn't make sense. They'd be like, oh, I don't got time for you. So I kind of sat on it. I prayed about it. I meditated on it. And I knew that eventually, God would reveal what my next step was to be. And what kept coming back to me was to reach out to a clan mother. And this clan mother, who I was reaching out to, is very familiar with our community, knows everything that had transpired, during my time and prior to my time as well, too. So if I took this situation to her, she would know, exactly what I meant. And so I called her up and I talked with her and I shared with her, like, my experience, this heart shift, like basically what I've just shared with all of you. And I didn't know what I was asking her, but ultimately I was asking her, like, hey, would you be willing to mediate or facilitate a conversation between myself and this individual? And she said, yes, absolutely. I would love to. So we moved forward in that and we met via Zoom, because it was still the pandemic, and this was in the early part of this year. So we met once a week, and we met via Zoom, and our first meeting, I was really nervous. I was sweating. Normally don't sweat that much, but I was sweating, and I was nervous. But almost excited at the same time. And one thing I want to let you know about forgiveness is when you go on that journey of forgiveness and you extend that forgiveness to another individual, there's never a guarantee that they're going to accept it. And I knew that, but it didn't change my heart. I knew that if this individual, cursed me out, said, Ronnie, I'm not accepting any of this, that still would have been okay. I still would have felt that way towards them, of forgiving. And so, when we met that first time, I just shared my heart. Basically, like I said, the story I've just shared with all of you. And the individual's response, while I go into it with no expectations, because my heart isn't going to change as a result of their response, I was really pleasantly surprised. They very warmly accepted what I was extending to them. And here was their response that really kind of blew me away. They said, Ronnie, you know what? And remember, this is the individual that was kind of like spilling the tea and creating all these small fires and everything. They said, Ronnie, you know what? As Haudenosaunee people, this is what we're supposed to be about in the first place. The Peacemaker brought the message of peace directly to us, and we recognize the significance in that. And so they said, this is what we're supposed to be doing in the first place. We're supposed to be honoring the peace, and we're supposed to be honoring it amongst ourselves first. So, how sad that we've actually not been doing that. But what a great opportunity we have now to move into that and to move forward with that. And it was like, wow. I mean, I was really blown away by their response. But after that too, after that Zoom meeting, you begin, once you express and extend that forgiveness, the amount of freedom and liberation that you feel it doesn't compare to anything. And I'm always reminded in how I'm forgiven and what Christ did to forgive me. So of course, it's upon me to extend that forgiveness in a same and perhaps similar manner. And I recognize too that it also encompasses the story of our peacemaker, of our culture. And like I said, I didn't grow up with our culture, but I feel like it's always, resided within me. One question I get asked very frequently is, well, Ronnie, how do you be a Native American and a Christian? I'm like, oh. You can be both, like it's okay. Certainly my Native American, my indigenous roots, those are embedded in me. God, specifically found a need to interweave those within me. But being a Christian, I have found that as an adult, as I began to discover my culture and learn about my culture in greater depth than I ever did, it actually enhanced my faith. It actually, kind of even more confirmed my faith. And so to me, I don't see it as there being a need to separate the two. To me, they're so complementary. And it's almost like, right, if you look at Haudenosaunee culture, I mean, so much of it is so similar to, the way that we believe as Christ followers. So anyway, as a result of our meetings, so we met once a week for, about 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks at the most. We didn't know what each week was going to comprise of, other than the first one, when I knew I was sharing my feelings of sorrowfulness and ownership over my actions, but then also extending the forgiveness. And so as we continued to meet, there were some asks that came about. And one of those asks was, would I be willing to write a personal statement to our community that talked just about, very specifically, everything we had just accomplished during our times of meeting? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. And I recognized that was part of the healing process. So, I extended the forgiveness. We had, that forgiveness exchange, if you will. We're reconciling. And I realized that's only the beginning of the healing process. And so I knew that following through and writing this letter, it was part of the healing process. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I'm willing to write it. And it was interesting because as I was writing it and talking about, all of what I've just shared with you, I was saying to my husband, I'm like, gosh, this feels really weird. It's almost like as I'm writing the letter, Like it's completely representative of like, wait, I'm the one that was wrong all this time. And to have the willingness to enter into that kind of territory, I also recognize that with forgiveness work, sometimes we have to be willing to sacrifice something. We have to be willing to sacrifice maybe our pride. We have to be willing to sacrifice that grudge that we hold on to and that resentment that we hold on to that feels good. And we're always trying to, redeem ourselves through that. Right. And we know that with Christ, he gave the ultimate sacrifice. So therefore, sometimes when we enter into that forgiveness, it's the same recognition that we're also sacrificing something as well. And then the last part that came out of that was that we were going to have a healing ceremony. And our intended hope in the healing ceremony is that it would begin to create a ripple effect within our community, because our community has definitely been in need of healing for a long time. And so what the healing ceremony would really comprise of is myself and this other individual sharing our story, sharing our forgiveness and our healing journey. And as we share that, we were advised by the clan mother to then exchange gifts. And it would be a traditional gift. So it would be something significant to our culture because the Haudenosaunee were known as gift givers. But as we exchange a gift, it's almost like symbolically, it seals the work that was just done so that nothing can undo that. So we would share like corn, white corn, or strawberry drink or something like that. And then the second piece of the healing ceremony would be however the clan mother sees fit and to continue out that ceremony. But ultimately, leaving it at a place where it begins to create this ripple effect of healing. Because if the two individuals can come before their entire community, the two individuals that represented roles of leadership, and if we can display how we were able to resolve our differences and forgive one another and have reconciliation and have this willingness to move forward in healing, I mean, the incredible freedom that provides and the incredible liberation, not only for ourselves, but hopefully to our community as they, see fit to take that message on themselves. So I covet your prayers for that last piece because it hasn't happened quite yet. The pandemic has kind of put restraints on, some of our gathering opportunities, and people's, scheduling, times to adjust all of that. So please, if you think of it, keep me in prayer of how all of that is supposed to continue to work its way out. And I want to leave you, I would be remiss, right, if I told this whole story and I brought this whole message of what I've experienced to you without following up with a charge for you, right? Because as Haudenosaunee, the Peacemaker left us with a charge that we are supposed to maintain and continue this message of peace daily throughout our lives. So the charge I leave with you is to think about how can forgiveness be exercised in your life? Because I'm sure as I told this story, there was someone that came to mind for you. There was a situation or a group maybe that came to mind for you where I should probably be exploring how I can, create forgiveness or how I can interweave forgiveness in this relationship. And understand too that the journey of forgiveness work, sometimes, because I experience this, sometimes you will have people that surround you that love you and they're well-intentioned, but they actually may have words towards you entering into this forgiveness experience that are actually discouraging. But remember, it's because they're seeing it through their lens and their eyes. You are on your own forgiveness journey for a very specific reason, because God intended for you to walk that journey out, that only He knows the fruit that is going to come from that, whether it's in this generation or generations to follow. And then also recognize too that sometimes traveling this journey, it can feel very lonely. But I knew that He, in the challenging times, I knew He never left my side. And as difficult as it was in knowing what I had to contend for, I knew that my loving God and my loving Savior were always there supporting me. So I just leave you with that charge and that challenge to be thinking of how you can enter in to a journey of forgiveness with a relationship or a situation in your life. Yeah.
But thanks, Ronnie, for sharing this. You know, this is a message our whole nation needs. This is a very apropos message. I think about God saying that he's going to shake everything that can be shaken. You got shaken, and your community was shaken. And yet that is how God brings the new thing, resurrection life. And he placed you there, one who knows, the Savior, to bring healing and truth and forgiveness and this new spark of life. You know, as I listened to you tell the story about the Peacemaker, I thought of that passage in Ecclesiastes 3 where it says that God has put eternity in everyone's heart. And so there are these wonderful stories in different nations that have come from their past because God is always speaking the truth, always reaching out to draw people to himself, always revealing his heart and his love to different people. And, you know, one of the things that makes it so special to have Ronnie here sharing about the First Nations people as we begin this whole month. First of all, she's an example of one who's sent. You're a sent one. You were sent into a really difficult thing to bring the love of God and to walk through difficult things to bring the truth of God to people who really needed to hear about forgiveness and love and see a different way. We're all sent ones. But also, there's an order in God. You know, it's important we honor the first people. God has an order. We've talked about it even prior to this, how, you know, the Lord said, I send you out, start in Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. And we start with Israel as we go out into the world, the understanding that his covenant plan began way back with Abraham and how it began to unfold for the nations. And we as God's people align our heart with God's order. But he's entrusted First Nations people, different parts of the world that are very important, and they have keys from God for the healing of the land. And so we just thank God for this. He's so magnificent and so huge and so large, and his heart is so wonderfully towards the humans that he's made. One thing I just want to mention, which just made me so happy for our region, was back, I think it was in 2017, when President Trump moved the embassy, the U.S. embassy, to Jerusalem, acknowledging really the First Nations in the sense of Israel being that was their land and Jerusalem their capital. I opened up one of the Israeli papers right after it happened to read, and their front page was this article about the Seneca Nation, how the chief of the Seneca Nation had sent them a letter congratulating them and saying to Israel how encouraging it is to see this happen. And we congratulate you, how you are First Nations people and how you've brought back your language and you're back in your land. And I think, you know, there's this wonderful order of God. God determines the places we live and the boundaries we're within for his good purposes. And as we honor what God has done and what he has planned, it puts everything back in order. So Lord, I just thank you for Ronnie. I thank you. This has not been an easy journey for her, and she's got lots of roads ahead of her. But I thank you for this bright light that you have sent into a place where she was able to unravel some stuff that needed to be unraveled so that the new can come. We bless the Haudenosaunee people, Father, in our region. We thank you for the gift that they have been to this nation, but also the gift that they are to us in this region. And I pray, Father, that you would be glorified and that the fullness of your plan would come forth in all the nations of the earth. But we especially pray for our region, Lord. We want to see the fullness of your plan come forth in our region with hearts reconciled back to you first, Lord, and then reconciled to one another. We praise you and we thank you for the greatness of who you are. And we pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.